Hello, everyone, and welcome to another amazing episode of the EDHRECast. I'm your host today. I'm Matt Morgan, and joining me, it's my co-host. He asked me what the 9th letter of the alphabet was, and I took a complete guess, but it turns out I was right. It's Dana Roach.
That's pretty good. It took me a second.
Yeah. I mean, I had to work it into our intros, so I just wanted to softball you one.
I'm distracted a little bit tonight. I got into a bit of an altercation with my neighbor. He's blaming my stupid driveway for making him fall down, but I think it was his dumb asphalt.
That's, living with neighbors, I get it. It's always easy to blame your neighbors.
Absolutely.
Hopefully you have some concrete evidence that it wasn't your fault.
There we go.
That was a forced one, but that's what we do, isn't it?
Those are the best ones sometimes.
That is the best one. Anyways, Dana, what are we talking about? We don't have Joey today, but that doesn't mean we're going to take a week off. So what are we talking about today?
We don't. We're just going to talk about Wilds of Eldraine and some cards that caught our eye and we thought were interesting and that were worth digging into a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on in this set, kind of par for the course. So let's just get right into it. But first, before we get into Wilds of Eldraine, let's just do some plugs real quick first.
Yeah, first I'd like to thank Chase, also known as Mana Curves, for helping editing the show. You can find them online at Mana Curves.
And if you'd like to support the show, you can do so by liking this video on YouTube, subscribing on YouTube, or subscribing on your local podcast app, or by going to patreon.com/EDHRECast, where we have patron tiers of all sorts of levels. Whether you want to join the Discord community for just $2 a month, there's that and more over at patreon.com/EDHRECast, including the weekly patron shout-out. So this week, Adam Pritchard, thank you so much for joining. We appreciate the support. I don't have any good puns. I'm sorry. Something with an Adam's apple. I don't know. Dana, anything?
Yeah, please. I don't either. We've without Joey here, we're apparently stumped.
We're no good without Joey, apparently. But that's fine. That doesn't mean we don't appreciate Adam's support. So thank you so much, Adam.
Yes, thank you very much. We do appreciate it.
But with that, Dana, why don't we just hop into it? So we're back in Eldraine. We have a whole bunch of new cards. We have new pre-constructed decks. There's a lot going on in Wilds of Eldraine. There's only, and I say this very loosely, only 25 legends, which is still a huge number.
Right, yeah. It just seems like a little bit less because we've been getting sets with like 40 or 50.
It does. So, I mean, right off the bat, were there any legends that seemed interesting to you? I know you're not going to build them because they're too new, but did anything at least catch your eye and think, oh, that kind of has a cool build path, or just get your mind going at least?
First thing that kind of jumped out at me was Hilda of the Icy Crown. 2 white-blue for a human warlock. She's a 3/4. It has a couple different abilities, but they're all triggered off of you tapping an untapped creature an opponent controls. When you do that, you can pay 1, and you can either create a 4/4 white and blue elemental. You can put a +1 counter on each creature you control, not just one creature, and you can scry 2 and then draw a card. That's got just everything you need on one card. There's a ton of card draw on there, and scrying 2 to draw a card is actually very, very good.
Yeah.
Putting a counter on every creature you control is very, very good. Making a 4/4 is very, very good. All of those things are very, very useful. It's a kind of deck that's going to be running cards that you don't see very often because you're going to want to go pretty deep on the tapping synergies in ways that, you might run a couple of those effects, but you're not going to be running 20 of them like you will in this deck.
No.
So while I'm not going to build it, I do kind of like things like this that are a kind of an unexplored space a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, finally I have a chance to play Retreat to Coralhelm. I'm probably not going to build this deck, but there's a ton. I feel like this is going to be a very cheap deck if you take out stuff that players are playing. I mean, Smothering Tithe, yes. Anointed Procession, sure. There's a lot of expensive cards in there, but for a majority of the deck, it looks like it's a bunch of just 50-cent commons and uncommons with some control aspects kind of built in.
Yeah, I think it's going to be kind of a rough deck to play against too. When you're looking at a deck that's built around doing control stuff, that can, if you're not ready for it, that can be a difficult thing to fight through. But I like the command. I think it's going to make an interesting deck. The other thing that jumps out at me from all of these legends, we've had blue-black fairy commanders before. Una, Queen of the Fae, being the kind of probably the most famous. But Una is maybe more of a combo commander even than a fairy commander, despite the fact that she makes fairies. And 6 mana is a lot as well. It's very playable, but like I think that's always kind of made people shy away. We've got like literally a half dozen new options for legendary blue-black fairy commanders. And while there's not massive differences between them necessarily, they let you kind of build the deck the way you want to build it. Talion, the Kindly Lord, is probably the one that's going to get built the most. It's the one that's getting built the most right now. It's a 3/4 with flying, and when it ETBs, you choose a number between 1 and 10. And whenever an opponent casts a spell with mana value, power, or toughness equal to that chosen number, that player loses 2 life and you draw a card. So that's just really good passive value there on a 4-mana commander. But there's plenty of other options if you don't want to build Talion too. I do think that's kind of nice that you could build a fairy deck right now in blue-black and have literally half a dozen different choices that kind of customize best to what you want to do versus, being stuck with 1 or 2 options.
Yeah, well, you have the new Alila Cunning Conqueror, which is another fairy typal commander that you can play. Tegwell, Duke of Splendor. You got 3 options, I guess, with the ones that you were just talking about that are all going to be legendary fairies that you can play something. You have a lot of new options. You have some good classic options out there. It's kind of funny seeing how all of a sudden it seems like every set there's 2 or 3 different creature types that all of a sudden they're getting 2 new commanders or 3 new commanders, and they're just kind of working their way through all of them. This kind of fit flavor-wise with whatever the set is. So it is cool to see fairies kind of get another opportunity to shine, because I don't remember at least anything good coming out of the last time we were in Eldraine. The original Alila, maybe kind of, sort of, but it wasn't really rewarding you. It was kind of, you're making fairies, yes, but you had to do non-fairy things to get them.
Yeah, this set really is leaning into it in a way I think the previous set didn't. And I think people were kind of expecting it to. And so, I mean, they're giving people maybe what they wanted this time. And that's, usually winds up getting people brewed a ton of decks. So I bet we're going to see a bunch of different blue-black fairy decks as a result of this, for sure.
There's also some interesting takes too. Kellen the Fey-Blooded, that one, it's the Boros legend that cares about having auras and equipments. But for the first time, it feels like you want a bunch of auras on Kellen, but you want a whole army too. And normally it's been, okay, we're playing Boros equipment. Right. We're going all in on one creature. But Kellen is doing it a little bit differently. So Kellen is a 2/2, it's 2 and a red. And it has a adventure side to it, so it's 1 and a white for the adventure side, so you can search your library for an aura or equipment, reveal it, put it in your hand, and then shuffle. So it's a tutor. And then Kellen, when it's on the battlefield as a creature, is a 2/2 with double strike. Other creatures you control get +1/+0 for each aura and equipment attached to Kellen the Fey-Blooded. And it's such a cool little take. I don't know if it's going to be terribly popular. It's kind of middle of the pack, it seems, right now, as far as most built commanders from the set. But it is interesting to see that normally it's either, you're playing a Boros go wide strategy and you're just doing everything you can to go wide, or it's going all in on one creature with the Voltron strategy. So I'm interested to see how this turns out, because it does have a lot of cool things going on for it, but also it might be a deck that it gets too divided on what it's trying to do, and you're not able to do both things well at the same time.
Yeah, I think it's going to let you maybe lean into one or the other when you brew it, but we've gotten a gazillion Boros equipment commanders, for example, over the years. And the problem is always, if someone shuts down whatever you're Voltroning up, then the deck kind of folds. Whereas this is a case where you can go wide at the same time as you suit something up. I wonder if Kellen's just not going to wind up being the best option. And kind of invalidate a bunch of those other commanders. I haven't spent enough time looking at it really to know if that's going to be the case, but double strike baked in and buffing all of your other creatures is really, really effective, along with a tutor on it as well. So I'll be curious to see if this doesn't long-term wind up eclipsing a lot of the other Boros equipment options we see.
Yeah, I agree. And I like the difference too. So we had Will and Rowan last time we were in Eldraine. They were planeswalkers together. Now they're legendary creatures, and they're kind of doing a cool spell cost reduction type of mechanic. So Rowan is now red and black, and Will is now blue-white. And they both have an ability where you can tap them, and then spells that are the color of the commander's color identity cost X less to cast, where X is the amount of either life you've lost this turn or life you've gained this turn. So it's kind of an interesting take, doing kind of two sides of the same coin, if you will. I'm curious what these decks are going to look like too, because I'm assuming the blue-white one, it's going to have some big mana spells like Expropriate, but I'm more curious, what are people going to be cranking out with Rowan, which is the Rakdos colored one, that are just these big spells that you want to cast for less than they should be costing?
I think there's a lot of combo stuff that works with that Rowan deck as well, which is what I've been seeing everyone brewing. Mm-hmm. It's really easy to abuse that spell reduction in that deck in a handful of different ways.
Yeah.
So I'm going to guess we're going to see that kind of be the commander that gets maybe played the most out of this set, because it's just got such a clear victory condition right there in the command zone. You play that, there's a bunch of different ways to combo out, and you're in colors that make it really easy to 2-drop those combos.
Yeah, I'm sure X spells are going to be very, very common. You look at the top played cards so far in the deck, Crackle with Power, Exsanguinate. But yes, there are some cool opportunities, but I'm hoping that what you said, Dana, it's just a combo win condition in the command zone. I hope that players get a little bit away from that, but also we've hoped for that type of thing before, so we'll see if that actually happens.
We also got a handful of like meme commanders too, whether it's Sir Ginger, the Meal Ender, or the Goose Mother, that people will build just because they're kind of funny and silly. And I always like seeing a mix of those in as well. And it generally feels like this is a set where they were very intentional with what they designed. Like this is the commander for this. This is the rat commander.
Yes.
This is the commander that's doing that. So I always like that. I would much rather have 25 focused legends than I would 50 that feel like half of them don't really have a home anyway. So I think that there's a nice balance here, and I think I like Eldraine in general as a plane too. So maybe I'm predispositioned to appreciate that, but. I will probably one day wind up building something from among these commanders, but right now I don't know what that will be.
Yeah, I'm not super jazzed to build anything from this set. I'm honestly still coming down from the high that was Lord of the Rings for
sure,
personally. Yeah. But I haven't shut up about that set for months, so nobody is surprised to hear me say that. But there are a few things that kind of like, oh, well, that looks cool. Maybe I'll spend some time working on it, but nothing obviously yet that has been like, oh my gosh, I gotta build this quite yet.
Right.
There were a couple cool kind of precons. I mean, Selesnya humans, right up my alley, but both of those kind of focus a little bit on the enchantment ends of things, and Enchantress isn't a strategy that I'm really super jazzed to build. I have a Tom Bombadil deck, and that's kind of my enchantment deck. So my boxes are already checked there, or any of the precon decks, any of the precon commanders, I should say. Any of them jump out at you, Dana?
Nothing necessarily that I'm super. I mean, like there's a couple more of the fairy ones in here that are mixed in. But no, I like Bernard Ginger Sculptor is the Bant commander. Each creature you control that's a food or a golem gets +2/+2 and has trample. And whenever another non-token creature you control dies, you can exile it. And if you do, make a token that's a copy of that creature, except it's a food golem artifact. As somebody who just built a Splicer deck in Simic colors, the problem with that is like there's a handful of good Splicer things in white as well, and this is actually if I was somebody interested in playing a 3-color deck, which I'm not, this would make a really good commander for a Splicer deck, since it does do things with golems.
Yeah. And
when those Splicers die, you can bring them back as a token copy that's still going to make you more golems, because they're pretty terrible anyway. So who cares if they're also a 1/1 food golem?
Yeah.
So like that was kind of funny. Like, oh, I built that Splicer deck, and here's kind of a perfect commander if I wanted all 3 colors for it. But other than that, no. I saw that we got a Korvold that was a little bit more down to earth than the last one, which is nice to see. But yeah, that was really it among those. How about yourself?
Nothing from the pre-constructed decks. I mean, down to earth for Korvold, it's asking a lot, but yeah. I mean, it still does a whole lot of really powerful things though. So it's 5 this time. So 5 generic mana, and Jund colors, so a red, a green, and a black. For a 4/4 Dragon Noble, this spell costs 1 less to cast for each card type among permanents you've sacrificed this turn. So the reduction is quite a bit harder to pull off. You need a good amount of varied permanents on the battlefield, plus sacrificing them. But Korvold does come out, has Flying, Trample, and Haste, and whenever Korvold deals combat damage to a player, you put X +1/+1 counters on Korvold and draw X cards, where X is the number of permanent types among cards in your graveyard. So it still has a whole lot of possibility to draw you a ton of cards and get very, very big very quickly. But at least getting Korvold on the battlefield has some hoops to jump through, because 8 mana,
yes,
8 mana in Jund colors. Sure, there's obviously ways to make a bunch of mana. You have green, but then the cost reduction, that's going to be kind of hard actually to pull off, because yes, you have treasures, but what are you really sacrificing often to kind of crank out your commander? And that's a really good question players are going to have to ask.
Yeah, it's going to require a lot more work in terms of brewing and the strategies you have to think about before you play than the previous Korvold did, that kind of, very easily went infinite with just any cards you shuffle into the deck. This feels like you have to, I used the word intentional before, but that applies here as well. It's a deck, it's a commander that you have to very much think about what you put into it to get the maximum efficiency out of it. And I always like seeing that versus something that just works with almost anything.
Yeah, I mean, don't tell Joey, but the most played card in Korvold deck so far is Baba Saga, which is one of his favorite commanders that he's been playing lately. But when you look at what Baba Saga does, you sacrifice up to 3 permanents, and then you draw a bunch of cards based on how many card types there were among those permanents. So that makes so much sense in this specific Korvold deck, because you need to be able to sacrifice a bunch of different types of permanents, because it's just it's the best mana dork for the deck.
So should we look at cards that would go in your 99 or in your actual base of your deck in 99 now?
I mean, I suppose so, because this set, even though it's fairy tales and lighthearted, there's some pretty scary and powerful cards in this set, and it's getting me excited for a few cards specifically. But what has jumped out to you first, Dana?
So the first one that I was most excited for right away was Stroke of Midnight.
I knew that was coming.
It's the second most played card in the set. Obviously we're 10 days into numbers, so take them with a grain of salt, but of all the cards in the set, it's going in decks just slightly less than a card I'm gonna guess we're gonna talk about here in a few minutes, Moonshiner Cavalry. So I immediately was like, I'm probably gonna want to run that in almost all of my white decks, but I started looking at making a few cuts today actually, and while I like Stroke of Midnight, 2 in a white for a destroy target non-land permanent, and its controller makes a 1/1 white human creature token. So Generous Gift makes them a 3/3. This makes them a 1/1, but it can't hit lands, where Generous Gift can hit lands. So 6 of one, 5,000 of the other. I think Generous Gift's probably slightly better, but it's really close. But when I went to look at making some cuts today, I was looking at a few different white decks, and I'm like, well, okay, I've got Swords to Plowshares and Path to Exile, and I've got Generous Gift in this deck, and I might have, Heliod's Intervention, and I might have Council's Judgment, and sometimes for various reasons I've got a Darkstone Mutation. I was having a really tough time finding room for this one more instant speed removal in a situation where I've already probably have 5 or 6 of those, plus a couple sorcery speed spells. I was kind of shocked, because I was sure this was going to be a card I was going to jam everywhere, and I found out when I was looking at a lot of my decks, I kind of felt like I had enough of those removal spells, and I didn't know if I wanted one more.
That's totally fair. So my question to you, because this is a question I'm kind of working through with evaluating this card for myself, how important is the non-land permanent versus being able to hit lands? Is that a huge difference in your mind, or is it kind of negligible?
It's pretty that's probably very meta dependent. There's probably some folks that just don't see Cabal Coffers or Nykthos, let alone a Gaia's Cradle or Sarah Sanctum or something. And if you don't see those half a dozen really backbreaking lands, maybe you don't really necessarily even care that much about removing people's lands. I like the alternative. I have absolutely been saved by a Beast Within or Generous Gift before, being able to hit someone's, Glacial Chasm or something.
Sure.
So it does make a difference. If I had to choose between the two, I would choose to have the option to hit a land, even though it makes a slightly bigger token.
Yeah.
For me, the problem just wound up being like I didn't feel like I just didn't want like a sixth one of those effects, and it felt like it's right on the edge of being like just one more of those things I needed, let alone once you start getting into, green where there is a beast within, or black where there's a ton of options in black. You're looking at Anguish Unmaking or Despark or whatever. I was struggling to find room for it, and I thought that wouldn't be the case. I was sure I wanted one more of these, and I discovered I guess I really didn't.
Yeah, I'm kind of in the territory of I'm valuing only giving them a 1/1.
Sure.
So to be completely honest, and plus two, I'm playing Ghost Quarter. I'm playing Tectonic Edge. If I really need things that can hit lands, I understand needing to prioritize flexibility. But for me, with so many of my decks, I'm turning things sideways. And so giving them a smaller creature, a 3/3 sometimes can still block effectively.
Sure.
Whereas a 1/1 can't. And so I'm almost in the camp of I don't mind losing a little bit of flexibility because I'm already running land destruction type of lands. And so giving them a smaller token in exchange for a little bit of loss of flexibility. But it's kind of like the great debate we had several years ago at this point. It was Utter End versus Anguish Unmaking.
Right. Yeah.
Are you valuing that 3 life for 1 less mana? But or Vindicate, but also this kind of puts the nail in Vindicate's coffin.
Right. Yeah.
Nobody's playing Vindicate anymore. But it's still getting printed at rare.
Right.
There's a lot of arguments to be made, and I don't think anybody's ever really going to be wrong either with it.
Yeah. I absolutely. I'm never going to tell this card is going to be fantastic in a bunch of decks. And honestly, for me, I'm a big fan of Council's Judgment. And this is probably better more often than not than Council's Judgment because instant speed, you're always going to get the target, whereas sometimes if you're ahead, people will play around. Like they won't remove the thing you want removed with Council's Judgment because you're leading. I think this is probably a slightly better card, but I just love Council's Judgment. I just think it's a fun card. So
yep.
If I was being honest in evaluation, I would probably find room for this by bumping Council's Judgment. But
I mean, if you're playing with Armad Angelo, you can't really count on him voting the way you need it to be. So
right.
Council's Judgment is a card that I don't get to play very much more. I love the card. I played it a lot back when it was a little more popular, but it's definitely faded because, like you said, you can't really rely on your opponent sometimes to prioritize the same way that you're going to. So taking that agency out, maybe sometimes, you miss the 2-for-1 and instead you're just straight up trading. But this card, it's powerful. I'm sure a ton of folks are going to be playing it. But we're splitting hairs at this point, really.
Well, so let's talk about another white card. How crazy is it that like the 2 most played cards so far from this set are both white cards?
They didn't really get creative on the design for the card that we're going to talk about either.
They did not. You can see it right there in the casting cost what they were going for. Moonshaker Cavalry, 5 a white. It's a Spirit Knight creature. It's a 6/6. It has flying, and when it enters the battlefield, creatures you control gain flying and get +X/+X till the end of turn, where X is the number of creatures you control. So it's
love it.
It's white's. Yeah, it's white's Crater Hoof.
Yeah. Well, and anything that says for the number of creatures you control, I'm automatically giving it consideration because I just, so many of my white decks are going wide, but that's also a ton of white decks in the format anyway. So I really like Moonshaker Cavalry. I know I'm not really making any like sweeping, unexpected statement there, but it's just so super powerful. I don't think it's quite as good as Crater Hoof. Evasion, I mean, we talked about just mechanics that are powerful and popular in Commander. Flying is probably one of the most powerful, especially when it comes to evasion keywords in the format. So it's wildly powerful. It's no surprise at all that it's one of the most played cards so far from the set.
Yeah. I mean, it's just a straight up win condition in white, at least if your deck is making any amount of bodies, and there's a ton of white decks that are going to be doing that. There's 2 ways for me to evaluate this. Like, if I'm just looking at it objectively based on how good this card is, it's fantastic, and it's going to win people a ton of games. And honestly, white probably needed a couple more win conditions like this, so I get why it's going to be so popular. On the other hand, like I have lost plenty of times to Crater Hoof Behemoth, and I can't remember any of those games really.
Sure.
Like it felt like an anticlimactic way to lose, or that is even the right way to phrase it. It just felt like something that you expect to happen, and then the expected thing happens, and it's just kind of is what it is. The same thing will happen here. Like, I'm going to lose to this plenty of times, and I will forget the game 10 seconds later, and that's maybe not something I love, but who cares, right? Like, you know, not everyone needs to, like, feel like every game was some real memorable, magical experience too, and some people just, like, need ways to close out games. So, it's perfectly fine.
Sometimes you need a safety valve. I like cards like this. Sometimes just board states get gummed up, especially when you look at the power level sometimes that I think so many of us started at, where we're just playing cards that we have. We open some packs, we put them in decks. And so if you're playing at that power level, like, sometimes those games can drag out so long. And that's why I don't mind cards like this, because games got to end. Sure. Somebody opens a pack and okay, well, this is just going to end those games. It's going to clean everything out, and we're going to be able to move on to the next game. So I still like this card, these types of cards, even where, like you said, it maybe not, it wasn't exciting, but it wasn't unexpected, I guess maybe is a different way to put that too, where, okay, like, it's a Moonshaker Cavalry. Of course it's going to do powerful things. That's what it's meant to do. So,
well, and like in a similar vein, Beseech the Mirror, 1 in triple black for a sorcery. It has Bargain, and I guess we haven't discussed Bargain before. It's the mechanic. It says you may sacrifice an artifact, an enchantment, or a token as you cast a spell. And you can search your library for a card, exile it face down, and then shuffle. And if the spell was Bargain, you can cast the exiled card without paying its mana cost if that spell's mana value is 4 or less. So it's a tutor that may let you cast the thing for free if you didn't go get a big thing. Again, like, it's one of those cards, you know, we've talked about how we've cut way down in the amount of tutors we run. So for us, like, on a personal level, I would imagine neither you or I really care about this card at all.
No, not really. Bargain, it's a different mechanic. I'm not really sure how to evaluate it because it seems like it's going to be fairly easy. We'll talk about the mechanics here in a little bit. But yes, the card itself, it's a tutor. It's kind of doing the thing. If it's a cheap enough effect, you get to cast it for free. Excuse me. So like maybe you still play 4 mana board wipes and you tutor that up and cast it for free. There's a few little things like that, you know, synergies that are built in. I understand why it's one of the most popular cards in the set so far. Am I going to be playing it personally? Absolutely not.
Yeah. It's a good example of, like, us separating whether or not we like a card with us understanding that it's objectively really, really good.
It is objectively very, very powerful. Yeah. So, and it almost objectively as powerful, I would say, as stealing the segue from Joey, even though Joey's not really here. Does that?
I think we can count it.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
So we're going to go into challenger stats real quick, as Joey likes to say, because we'll still say Joey's spiel, even though he's not here.
Sure.
There's a ton of data on EDHREC, and we don't always agree with it, so we're going to challenge some stats and point out where some of these things are that we don't agree with. But first, we're going to take a real quick break.
This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. Do you ever find that just as you're trying to fall asleep, your brain suddenly won't shut up? Do your thoughts start racing right before bed or at other inopportune moments? It turns out one great way to make those racing thoughts go away is to talk them through. I know this happens to me all the time, where it feels like a thought is trapped in my head and it's abstract and therefore hard to put down, unless I give myself space to put it into words. And it's even more helpful if there's a professional to help you through that confusing process. Therapy gives you a place to do that, so you can get out of your negative thought cycles and find some mental and emotional peace. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Get a break from your thoughts with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/EDH today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/EDH.
Football is back and in full swing with another week of amazing games. Will the Wizards triumph over the Dragons? Can the Pirates beat the Zombies? Are any of those actual NFL teams? Who knows? I play a children's card game. Regardless, DraftKings has you covered. DraftKings Sportsbook is an official sports betting partner of the NFL. Download now and use code EDH to sign up. New customers can take home $200 in bonus bets instantly just for betting $5. That's code EDH only on DraftKings Sportsbook, an official sports betting partner of the NFL. The crown is yours. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or visit www.1800gambler.net. In New York, call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369. In Connecticut, help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org. Please play responsibly. On behalf of Boot Hill Casino and Resort, 21 plus, age varies by jurisdiction. Void in Ontario. See dkng.co/football for eligibility, terms, and responsible gaming resources. Bonus bets expire 7 days after issuance. Eligibility and deposit restrictions apply. So the first challenge here was sent to us by listener Glowworks, and the card is Belt of Giant Growth. And the challenge is in Gargos Vicious Watcher deck specifically. And the reason, it's only in currently 48 of those decks, but Glowworks says it should be in more. And the reason is because most Hydras have a base power and toughness of 0/0. And the way Belt of Giant Growth works is it gives creatures a base power toughness of 10/10. And the equip is cheaper the higher power a creature has. So that winds up being tricky. If you have a 1/1, it's going to cost you 9 mana to equip it. You don't want that. However, if you have a Hydra that has a base power and toughness 0/0 and a bunch of counters on it, then you have this weird narrow window where you can equip that belt very cheaply. But because the creature's base power and toughness was already a 0/0 or a 0/1, 1/1 in some cases, they get a really big power and toughness boost in addition to it being cheap to equip. So that is actually a really useful use for that card that I hadn't thought of. I remember when I first saw it thinking like, I don't really know where I want to give my creatures that boost in a deck where it's not going to cost me a gazillion mana to do so. Well, Hydras are the perfect place to do it. And I actually dug into the stats a little bit. 3 of the top 4 most played Hydras in Gargos decks are either 0/0s or 0/1s for base power and toughness. There's 4 more of those in the top 10 that are 0/0s. So 7 of the 10 most popular Hydras in Gargos decks have basically, 0/0 or 1/1 power, and 9 of the top 12.
Yeah.
So the next 2 out of the top 10 also are. So basically, aside from your commander, most of the Hydras you play in that deck are going to have low power and toughness. They're probably going to come into play with a bunch of counters on them, and then you can equip that belt for nothing, basically giving them a +10/+10 boost for very, very little mana. So yeah, I think that's you've kind of found the perfect deck for it there. Glowworks. I like Belt of Giant Growth and Gargos decks. So if you need a way to boost those Hydras and want to slam through and smash them in the face, that's a good way to do it.
Yeah, that's absolutely a solid pick. So my card that I'm challenging this week is one that I recently was blown out by. And by blown out by, I mean I couldn't do anything about it. And it was super, super frustrating to see how powerful it was. And it's another card that comes from March of the Machine Aftermath. I know that I've challenged several cards from this set already, but this card, or this set, I should say, truly is like just so forgotten about and there's so many hyper powerful cards in there. So the card that I'm challenging this week, because it ranched me too many times, is Rebuild the City. So it is 3-inch Jund colors, so a black, a red, and a green for a sorcerer that says choose target land, create 3 tokens that are copies of it, except they're 3/3 creatures in addition to their other types, and they have vigilance and menace, but they are still affected by summoning sickness. So this is a fantastic way to make blockers for yourself, but also if you have, say, like a flipped Growing Rites of Itlimoc that turns into basically Gaia's Cradle, you have so much mana. And there are several commanders out there that they're able to not just get very, very powerful lands like Cabal, Coffers, anything like that, but they're able to do it reliably. And so all these commanders that are landfall dependent or just a land deck, Lord Windgrace, Soul of Windgrace, whatever Windgrace you really want, but also Omnath Locus of All. There's a whole bunch of different very, very powerful landfall type commanders that you can play this in. And it's just absolutely a house. So not only do you get 3/3 blockers, like we just got done talking about 3/3 blockers, they're not nothing to shake your head at, but you also get to pick the most powerful land. It doesn't even have to be yours. There's a whole bunch of things that you can be doing with this card. I was so blown away with it. It's a 50-cent card, and it truly, I haven't seen it until this, and all of a sudden it came up and it was just doing absolute work. If you need a powerful deck in a lands matter type of strategy, this card is just so much that you want to be doing all in one package. So definitely give Rebuild the City a try. You're just going to make a bunch of mana, folks. I'm sorry. I have nothing else to say. It's just great.
All right, so should we jump back into some of the stuff from Eldraine here?
Yeah, we may as well. So there are a couple new mechanics that we didn't want to talk about. So Dana, you had mentioned Bargain as a mechanic so far, but there are two other new ones that we wanted to talk about too. One is Rolls, which are kind of auras that go on to your creatures that give different abilities based on what role it is. But there's also Celebration. And so I have a feeling I kind of know what you're going to say, but what are you thinking of these new mechanics? Are they catching your eye at all? Is it something worth really talking about? How are you feeling about these new mechanics?
Celebration doesn't do much for me, but I do think Rolls is pretty interesting. It's a little confusing isn't the right word. It's a lot to keep track of, I guess, would be what I would say, because there's a handful of different roles. And how it works is, say a creature comes into play, it will have an ETB ability where it says you create let's say a sorcerer role attached to a creature, and maybe it's a creature you control, maybe it's not, it will say in the text. And that's basically you're creating an enchantment or a token that goes on to that creature, and depending on what the particular role is, it does a different thing. So the sorcerer role, for example, it gives a creature +1/+1, and it gives it whenever this creature attacks, scry 1. There's a handful of different roles that do different things, and like the Wicked role, for example, the creature gets +1/+1, and when the aura is put in the graveyard from the battlefield, each opponent loses a life. And there can only be one role on a creature at a time. So if the creature dies, that role goes to the graveyard and triggers a thing, or if you put another role on it, the previous role is destroyed. You probably are going to need some infinite token type tokens to keep track of a lot of this.
Yes.
Because there is, I think, 8 or so different roles between the commander decks and the actual main set.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a lot to keep track of, but they're also kind of interesting, I think. There's a lot of different things you can do with those, whether it's, sacrificing things to your own bargain, or, shutting other people's creatures down, or like giving a little buff that sticks around for a while. I do think there's kind of an interesting design space for sure.
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of take on making something unique that also fits the flavor of the set. And so having kind of a little bit of a D&D influence, I would say. It's not quite party mechanic, but giving them like the virtuous role or whatever it is.
Yeah.
That one's obviously very, very powerful, because the virtuous role, whenever you attach it to a creature, that creature gets +1/+1 for each enchantment you control. So if you're doing a lot of different roles, or you're just going wide with enchantments, that gets really powerful really quick. All That Glitters is a very, very powerful card that folks know about, and you're basically putting that on other different creatures. Now, you lose a little bit of power because it doesn't count artifacts, but still, that's a very, very powerful effect. So I'm curious how played these cards get, other than maybe like a couple one-offs now and then. Nothing really shouts you have to be playing this or it's going to be a big player in any given deck. But it is interesting. I do think that there's going to be a lot of folks trying this mechanic out, but I also don't think there's anything near as powerful as any of the cards that we've talked about before. And Celebration, I anticipate never seeing this mechanic just in Commander. It's not hard to trigger when you think about all the treasures that you could be making, but the roles definitely, I think, will pop up every now and then, and hopefully in a cool and interesting way in some of those decks.
Yeah, Celebration feels much more like a limited style mechanic than it is one meant for eternal formats like Commander. The one role card I think that caught my eye the most was Asinine Antics, which is a fantastic name to start with.
Yeah.
It's a sorcery for 2 and a blue, and you can cast it as though it had flash if you paid 2 more, so you can spend 6 to cast it as an instant speed spell. Each creature your opponent controls, you create a cursed role token attached to that creature. So basically, each other creature is a 1/1. That's not going to do any good if it's wearing equipment, or it has +1 counters on it, or it has auras on it, or whatever. But like in a lot of cases, that's just going to permanently turn creatures into 1/1s. And it's not just that turn, that sticks around until they deal with removing the role somehow.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a big fan of that. It's not really a board wipe, but it's not a board wipe, I guess, too, in blue. And the fact that it sticks around for the game moving forward until someone deals with it, I think is quite interesting too.
Mm-hmm.
So of all the role cards, that's the one that caught my eye the most, and I'm gonna guess I'll probably see the most often as well.
Yeah, I like this a lot in kind of the same way that Sudden Spoiling kind of really messes with the timing of a lot of things that are happening.
Yep.
You play that and all of a sudden blockers are messed up or the combat step is messed up.
Right. Yeah.
This costs a little bit more if you're trying to do it as a combat trick, but it's still, the power is there. I mean, reducing everything to a 1/1, that's super, super powerful. They still keep their abilities. That is a big thing to keep in mind, though. I think a lot of folks might see that and say, oh, they're just 1/1s.
Right.
They still keep their abilities. So that is very, very important to keep in mind. It's not a humility, but it's not far off either.
We also got Adventure has returned, but there's a bit of a twist this time. In the past, there's always been the adventure portion. You cast a spell, and then the creature goes on an adventure, and you can eventually cast it from exile back into play. But it was always a creature, like we just said. That's not limited to creatures this time around. There are enchantments, for example, that can come back from an adventure. So that's they've expanded that design space a little bit, and I think I find that intriguing. I always felt a little bit like it was just another variation on Flashback or something for the most part. Adventure was with a cooler card frame. The fact that it can come back as a different thing, I guess, makes it feels a little bit more separate than it did before to me, where it just felt like they were trying to make an existing mechanic feel a little bit different, and it never felt that different to me, I guess. I don't know why that is. But being able to cast other things beyond creatures from it, I feel like separates it a little bit more. And I am glad to see Adventure back this time for sure.
Yeah, I do like Adventure. There's some real powerful spells and creatures too.
Yeah.
With Adventure on there. Mosswood Dread Knight. I know this is a Commander podcast, but that thing is going to wreck in Standard.
Yeah.
I've seen so many people very, very excited for it, and it's just going to be difficult to get rid of. But all of those, the human knights that you're going to see in all those different colors, those are all super, super powerful. So I think those will all maybe find their way a little bit into Commander a little bit, but I think more for Standard. But yeah, seeing Adventure come back, remember folks, so the Rules Committee did say that casting your commander that has Adventure from the command zone, that's still going to count towards the command tax.
Yes.
So keep that in mind. It's not just casting it as a creature. So if you cast it for the adventure, that counts as one time casting your commander. It's going to be very, very important, and you'll want to make sure you're not losing track of that.
We also got a cycle of creature lands. Are you someone, do you play creature lands at all in Commander? I know they have seen play in Eternal formats in the past competitively. Do you like them in Commander?
I like them in theory, but I never have too much of a chance to play them because
sure.
the mana investment more often than not kind of keeps them out. I would rather be spending my money spending my money better, yes, but spending my mana a little more proactively than maybe holding up 4 mana, for example, with Restless Cottage, which is the Golgari colored one. I'd rather not keep up effectively 5 mana when you think about it, because Restless Cottage also has to be untapped.
Yeah.
So effectively 5 mana to have a 4/4 blocker, for example. When it does attack, you create a food and exile up to 1 target card from a graveyard. So there are a little bit different abilities that I think might play their way into Commander, but I don't love having to reinvest all the mana into animating a land to make it a creature or an emergency block or anything like that. I used to play them a lot. I haven't really in a couple years. So I'd be curious if people play that, because if you need mana fixing on your lands, there are so many better dual lands that you can be playing. We've gotten just a deluge of just quality land cycles. So you're not playing this to fix your colors. You're playing this for some other reason. And I don't know if the mana investment is going to be worth it for a majority of these creature lands.
I tend to agree. So you mentioned Restless Cottage, so let's read that briefly, because that's maybe the best of the bunch, or one of the best of the bunch.
Probably.
Comes into play tapped. It taps for Golgari, so it is a dual land. You can spend 2 and Golgari, so 4 mana, and like you said, 5 technically because it's using itself. It becomes a 4/4 black and green horror until end of turn, and whenever it attacks, create a food token and exile up to 1 target card from a graveyard. That's a ton of stuff. So it's a 4/4, which is not an insignificant body that you're swinging with. You're going to make a food token that you can use to sacrifice to something or to gain a little bit of life, or one of the dozen different ways you can kind of abuse that mechanic. And you're going to remove something scary from someone's graveyard. That's a lot of things. But I always feel like with creature lands, when I'm have one in play and I'm looking at my hand, it's never what I want to be using my mana on that turn.
Yeah.
And even something as good as Restless Cottage with as many abilities on it as are there, I still think I'm going to look at that and be like, I have better things to do this turn than make a food token and remove one card from a graveyard and swing with a 4/4 that might die and cost me then a land.
Yeah.
So like even the ones like this one that have a ton of things on the card, myself, I feel like it's never what I want to be doing in the game unless you have some real specific bit of synergy.
So I think the only one that I probably would be considering is Restless Bivouac, which is the red and white one. Just because it's only 3 mana, so you're in Boros colors. 3 mana, like I said, effectively 4 because Bivouac has to be untapped and attack to get its ability. But when it attacks, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So you're at least getting some sort of permanence to the benefit. It only becomes a 2/2 though, so it's not great. None of them really are. Your lands are just, people cut lands for spells all the stinking time anyways, and I would wager most people aren't playing enough lands anyways. So there's so much competition in your land slots to begin with. I know that, Dana, you love utility lands, and if you're even lukewarm on these, I'm not sure if these really cut it when it comes to how much you're going to be playing them in Commander.
Yeah, like I said, I think you just have to have some real specific synergy that none of these really give me necessarily. And like for example, I have an equipment deck, and Arden is in the command zone who can equip stuff for free. Well, creature lands are great in that deck because if somebody board wipes and I've got a blink moth sitting there, I can make it into 1/1 and cast Arden and just equip everything onto that 1/1 creature for free and swing at somebody. So like that, in that situation, I find them very, very useful. In a general sense, I just almost never want to use them. So yeah, it's interesting that they keep going back to this well, and I'm curious. I feel like I don't see them very often in Commander either.
Yeah, I don't remember the last time that I saw any of the 2-color creature lands being played a whole lot.
Yeah.
They just don't stack up. The value that they get in 60-card formats is absolutely there, but
yeah,
I don't know if it translates all that well into Commander. So I will be curious if folks pick up on these a whole lot, but like I said, if you're doing it for your mana fixing, I don't think that this really has enough value there, especially when you have so many better options that don't come into play tapped all the time.
Hey there, Joey from the editing booth here. I know that I wasn't present for this recording, but I just couldn't help myself. I couldn't let this episode end without jumping in to mention a few other cards that I thought were really, really cool. They might not have been as exciting to Matt and to Dana, but they were definitely really exciting to me. So, I know they already talked about Rowan, who I really like, but Ariette of the Charmed Apple also looks like total gas. And Ariette and Rowan are really jockeying for the most popular legend spot from this set so far. But Ariette, enchant your opponent's stuff so that they can't attack you and then drain life every turn for each aura you control? That's cool. This is such a great take on Enchantress. It'll flourish with stuff like Killian in the deck. It's a great spot to use like minions return effects to steal any creatures that die. And Matt, I know you like Grim Guardian. This seems like a great deck to make use of that card to drain even more life with even more Constellation triggers. As for cards in the 99, the reason I had to jump in here is because I feel a necromantic compulsion to spread the word about Lich Knight's Conquest. 5 mana black sorcery, sacrifice any number of artifacts, enchantments, and or tokens, and revive that many creature cards from your graveyard. I've already ordered one of these cards from my Will Health deck. This card is so exciting to me. Late game, turn a bunch of mana rocks you don't need anymore into a huge zombie revival. Like food and treasure decks can channel all of those excess trinkets into a huge late game swing with this thing. And if you're playing an all enchantment or artifact deck, you can even sacrifice like enchantment creatures or artifact creatures and immediately return those very same creatures to the field to get more, constellation effects or really awesome enter the battlefield triggers. This reanimation spell won't go everywhere, but the places that it will go are impressive as heck. And I also, lastly, just want to shout out Gruff Triplets because I think it's one of my favorite designs in a long time. Green, 6 mana trampling 3/3 that makes 2 copies of itself when it enters, and whenever any of the triplets die, the others get bigger equal to the dead one's power. So if one dies, the others become 6/6s with trample, and if another one dies, then you are left with a 12/12 with trample. This is a really cool blink target to make even more of them. It's a great thing to sacrifice and bring back from the dead multiple times over and just make a huge army of huge triplets. This card's just really fun. I like this design a lot. This new Eldraine set looks really fun to me. I only wish that we had gotten a new version of Sir Conrad the Grim. I don't even know if that character's actually still alive in the lore, but I mean, Wizards of the Coast, if you're listening, Zombie Conrad would be a really cool thing to see in the future, just saying. That'd be kind of neat. All right, thanks everyone. That's it from me. Back to the guys.
So one last thing I want to touch on, and I think last week's show I talked about it a little bit with regards to that blue-black fairy deck. In the past, I've had decks of my own, and then WotC has released a Precon that it was in similar colors with a similar theme, and I'm like, oh, I'm gonna wind up using like 3 or 4 of those cards or something, right? I had once upon a time I had a green-red landfall deck, and they release a deck that does landfall stuff. I'm like, oh, there's a handful of cards there that are quite good in my landfall deck, so I'll move them over. I had a blue-black fairy deck that I use kind of casually. There was one I oftentimes let friends use that didn't have a deck. It wasn't necessarily a budget deck, though. Like I had some pretty decent cards in there. And despite that, 15 cards out of that deck, if I'm really going to upgrade it, I could put 15 cards out of Eldraine, Wilds of Eldraine, into that deck. There are so many juiced fairies in both the base set and that Precon.
Yeah.
I've never I had a deck of mine where I'm like, oh, I'm replacing almost a fifth of this deck with creatures and a couple of spells that work so well with that particular theme. That's nothing I've ever seen like that before. Like that deck is so good with so many good cards for that kind of that particular type. It's mind-blowing.
Yeah, well, remember how I said last week that Commander almost has become a rotating format at this point? Not officially, but it really does. And you just narrated it kind of perfectly, Dana. You have a deck that has the same colors, same strategy, same creature type in this exact instance. Well, they just released a new deck that kind of replaces so many of the cards you were playing. I hate to assign intent because you really shouldn't be doing that, but almost it feels intentional because they give you all of these wildly powerful fairies that are just pushing out these ones that they're doing almost the same thing, just a little bit better, or you're getting some more upside or whatever it is. And it's so hard to keep up. And I noticed recently when I was playing against the Sliver Precon that, again, they find some creature type that hasn't really gotten love lately, and they give it some new toys. They gave Slivers the last time with the Commander Masters, and now they're giving fairies. Now they're in Wilds of Eldraine. And holy cow, like these are just all so great and powerful. You don't even need to really be playing all of them in a fairy specific deck.
Yeah, it's nuts. And then it brings up one more then thought, and this might feed back into Stroke of Midnight as well. We've talked in the past about some of the power creep that's happened, and like clearly we're looking at a situation here where almost every fairy release in the set is better than the fairies that were in the existing fairy deck, or at least better than 15 of them for sure.
They were.
So we're seeing that, but we're also seeing a situation like where Stroke of Midnight that 5 years ago would have been an auto-include, I feel like, and I'm struggling to find room for it. I wonder if there's this point we hit where the power creep occurs so much that you're just replacing great cards with great cards. Because that wasn't always the case. Like I remember years ago, and I made a joking tweet about it today, but like I remember, 2014, 2015, when a set would come out, the cards I was replacing were bad in a lot of cases, right? If I'm running my Death Touch deck or I'm running my Sphinx deck, there's a bunch of bad Sphinxes or there's a bunch of bad creatures with Death Touch. And I replaced those when they would print this one new thing that was significantly better, and I would replace them with a better thing. At this point, though, I wonder if power creep hasn't hit this point where you're replacing a thing instead of this thing that's massively better. You're like, oh, it's a side grade, or maybe it's slightly better, or you're not replacing it at all because you're like, oh, Stroke of Midnight, maybe I don't necessarily even need that. I wonder if there's some weird equilibrium we're not going to hit at some point where they're still printing these bombs, but you're also like, I've already got a deck full of bombs. I don't need these 3 or 4 unless I want to put them in my deck.
Well, I think that's when we're going to get to the point where why don't you just have 2 fairy decks, Dana?
Maybe, right. Maybe, I guess. Yeah.
Who knows? Yeah.
But no, I do wonder though if that isn't kind of a weird way the format self-balances a little bit, where you're just not, people aren't running bad cards anymore because there's just so many good ones for the thing they're doing that like it kind of reaches equilibrium for everyone.
Yeah. And it's hard to say because, man, we're getting deep in the weeds with this question
yes,
too.
For sure. Yeah.
I hope that we hit some sort of balance, but also, like I said last week, I wouldn't have been able to imagine where we are in the game in 2023 if you would have told me about some of these cards 10 years ago or 5 years ago even. And so now that the fact that we are here, it's so hard for me to just be able to predict where card design is going to be, because I never in a million years would have imagined some of these card designs that were coming out with, like Orcish Bowmasters would have absolutely made Richard Garfield have an aneurysm. It's so powerful. And so a lot of these cards, it stinks that, they are probably pushing out some pet cards, but you still can play the cards that you want to play. But also, I just wish you weren't being punished for playing the cards you want to play instead of the cards that are right. Because there are some very cool and exciting cards that I'm going to be putting into my decks from this set. And you're right, but that also kind of comes with the territory of playing a singleton format where you're always going to have these hard cuts. You're always going to have these cards that you're attached to, because that's just the deck building expression that players get. That's a huge chunk of why folks play Commander as opposed to 60 card formats. And so I think there's always going to be a little bit of kind of when you're trying to feed your kid and you're like, okay, eat your peas. And the kid's like, no, I don't want my peas. I want what I want. I think there's still going to be a little bit of that effect going on with Commander players. They're still going to say, I know this card is technically right. Like technically Expropriate is probably a right card in every blue deck. But people are still saying, I really don't like what that does. I mean, there's a reason the salt list exists on EDHREC.
Sure.
And I think that might kind of hit a point where it's not because the cards are ruining the game and ruining the experience within the game. I'm just kind of sick of playing all these cards that I'm forced to be playing, and I'm just going to go back to playing the cards I want to play. So I hope that makes some sense, maybe.
Yeah, like the way I was thinking of it, I was just thinking like, if everything becomes a staple or an auto-include, then doesn't nothing become a staple or auto-include, right?
Yeah,
like,
if everything's special, nothing's special, yeah.
Right, so like if we've got a gazillion different things that are like at Stroke of Midnight level power in white, or a gazillion different, blue-black fairies that are much more powerful than something you ran years ago, well, then you can still kind of sculpt your deck a little bit, because you're not necessarily downgrading or making choices, because there's just so many powerful choices. Now there's unforeseen problems with that too, maybe, but probably it'll be interesting to see where it goes for sure.
Yeah, I do think that eventually we might top out and plateau with the power curve, so we still get cool and interesting designs, but everything is suddenly on level footing. So I do think that might happen, but it's like I said, it is so stinking hard to be able to predict that.
Yes.
So I'm just going to refrain. But like I said, I'm still going to play Giant Inheritance. That card seems absolutely rad. There's a lot of fun things that are going on here. We get courts again. We got a court cycle in Commander Legends.
Oh, yeah.
Now we're seeing them again. The Monarch, we have more cards for that. So there's a lot of cool things that are going on in the Commander set specifically. And yeah, I hate that we kind of took a little bit of maybe a critical turn, but also we like to be critical when it's appropriate, and this certainly does.
Yeah.
Like you said, Dana, it is an appropriate time to be critical of kind of are we really being forced to play certain cards because they're just too powerful not to?
Yeah, and I'm hoping we do find some balance with that, but it's, like you said, yeah, I agree. If it's something worth criticizing, it's absolutely worth talking about in that way, for sure.
Yeah. Well, one thing I'm going to be critical of is my own ability to segue now that Joey's not here. So why don't we go ahead and wrap this show up here? We've done a lot of talking. I think there's a lot. Hopefully everybody at home realizes we really do like this set. We really, really do.
Yeah. Actually, I didn't realize how much I was looking forward to this. We had that run of all the Phyrexian sets, and it felt like you were building towards something. And then, Lord of the Rings set being Lord of the Rings, that was kind of monumental. this felt like a kind of a fresh start a little bit. Like, there's not a lot of previous baggage. I don't need to worry about the previous 6 Phyrexian sets or, Lord of the Rings is kind of this weird special thing. I liked that this felt self-contained and kind of removed from everything else. And I'm a fan of, like I said, Eldraine anyway as a plane. So, this has been kind of a little bit invigorating to see all these cards, and I'm looking forward to brewing with them for sure.
Yeah, it was a good way to refresh the palate. Hopefully that's an appropriate way to sum up what you said. But
sure.
I do agree that the scope of the set seems so much more manageable for me.
Yeah, 100%.
Awesome. Well, why don't we go ahead and wrap it up then? We'll head out. So Dana, where can everybody find you on the social medias?
You can find me online at Dana Roach. I'm writing articles for EDHREC and Commander's Herald. And you can find all of us together at patreon.com/EDHRECast.
And I'm Matt Morgan. You can find me online on pretty much any social media platform at Mathimus55. And we are streaming over at twitch.tv/EDHRECast. So make sure you tune in for those as well. You can find Joey on social media at Joseph M. Schultz. And thank you to Chase for doing the post-production, helping Joey with all the editing. So we definitely appreciate all of that as well. But everyone, that's it. So let us know in the comments, please, what you're excited about from this set. Wilds of Eldraine it's a spanning set, so please let us know in the comments what you think about the set as well. And don't forget, as Joey loves to say, make sure you EDHREC your deck before you wreck your deck.